Hello, friends. Welcome to another thrilling tale from the Old West. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart and reveal the strength of the human spirit, don't forget to leave your like and comment what you think. Your participation is very important for us to continue bringing these incredible stories. Lumberjack sees obese noblewoman auctioned for $2 with sack over her head, marries her when she says, "Father, Jake." Sullivan's axe split the cold October air of 1873, cleaving through the pine trunk with a dry crack that echoed across Wind River Valley. At 32, Jake was known as the best lumberjack in Wyoming territory, a man who found more comfort among silent trees than in the rowdy company of Cheyenne's saloons. His calloused hands and broad shoulders told the story of 15 years, felling wooden giants. Ever since he'd left Tennessee after the Civil War, sweat ran down his red beard, even in the biting morning cold. Jake Sullivan. Tom Wheeler's voice shattered his concentration. The plump merchant came running up the trail, his face red from exertion. "You need to come to town right now." Jake lowered his axe, frowning. "What is it this time, Tom? If it's about that bill at the general store." "No, it's not that." Tom stopped, catching his breath. "It's about today's auction. Judge Harlan's auctioning off the insolvent debtors. They say there's a peculiar situation." Jake spat on the ground. He hated those auctions. Seeing people sold to pay debts made him remember things he'd rather forget. "What's that got to do with me?" "Well," Tom hesitated. "There are rumors about one of the people in the auction, a woman. They say she keeps repeating one word." "What word?" "Father. She just says father, Jake, and there's more." Tom lowered his voice. "She's got a sack over her head. Nobody's seen her face." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something about it that stirred buried memories. He looked at the pile of cut logs, then at the gray sky promising snow. How long until the auction? 2 hours, at most. Jake grabbed his worn leather jacket. "I'll get my horse." The ride to Cheyenne took an hour through trails Jake knew with his eyes closed. The town buzzed with more movement than usual. Wagons and horses crowded in front of the courthouse, where a wooden platform had been erected. Jake tied Thunder, his black Mustang, and pushed through the crowd. The auction had already begun. Judge Harlan, a skeletal man with vulture eyes, presided over the proceedings with cruel efficiency. "Next lot," he shouted. "Margaret Henderson, debt of $200 to the Bank of Cheyenne." Jake watched as they brought the woman out. She was large, that was undeniable. The worn gray dress barely contained her voluminous form, but it was the burlap sack over her head that made Jake's stomach turn. Through the roughly cut holes for eyes, he could see the glint of tears. "We'll start at $50. The judge shouted. Silence. 25. More silence. Some men laughed. $10, gentlemen, a bargain." The woman swayed, and Jake clearly heard when she murmured, Father, $5. The judge was getting irritated. That's when Big Pete Johnson, owner of the worst brothel in town, yelled, $2, and only because I need someone to wash dishes." The crowd exploded in laughter. Jake felt something break inside him. Maybe it was the way she held her head high, despite the humiliation. Maybe it was that word repeated like a prayer. Or maybe it was because he knew the weight of loneliness. $3, Jake heard his own voice say. The laughter ceased. Everyone turned to stare at him. Big Pete growled. "For 10, Jake said calmly. 15, Pete was red with anger. $50, Jake declared, pulling the leather pouch from his pocket. It was almost everything he'd saved. Judge Harlan banged his gavel quickly. "Sold to Jake Sullivan for $50. Jake climbed onto the platform and handed over the money. When he approached the woman, she lifted her hooded head. "Father," she whispered through the sack. "No, ma'am," Jake said gently, "but you're safe now. Let's get this off you." His hands trembled slightly as he untied the sack. When the cloth fell away, Jake found himself looking at a round face, marked by tears, with blue eyes that seemed lost somewhere distant. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something in those eyes. "What's your name?" Jake asked. She blinked, as if waking from a dream. "Margaret," she said hoarsely. "Margaret Henderson. But I can't remember. Where's my father?" Jake's heart clenched at the confusion in her voice. Whatever had happened to this woman, it had broken something inside her. He offered his arm. "Come on, Miss Henderson. Let's get you somewhere safe." As they walked away from the platform, Jake heard the whispers start. He'd just spent his life savings on a stranger, a woman who might be mad. But looking at Margaret's trembling hands and lost eyes, He knew he'd made the right choice. Some things mattered more than money. Jake led Margaret away from the curious crowd, gently guiding her by the arm to where Thunder waited. The horse snorted nervously at the smell of fear and despair emanating from her. Margaret stopped abruptly, her eyes wide and fixed on the animal. I can't," she whispered, backing away. "The horses, they told right," Jake said softly. "Thunder's gentle as a lamb. But we can walk if you'd prefer." Margaret nodded gratefully, adjusting her worn dress. Jake noticed her hands were shaking, and there were old bruises on her wrists. Whoever this woman was, she'd been through ordeals that went beyond simple debts. As they walked down Cheyenne's main street, Jake could feel the stares and hear the whispers. A woman spat as they passed. A group of minors laughed and made obscene comments. Jake kept his chin high and his hand protectively on Margaret's elbow. "I need to take you somewhere," Jake said. "Do you have any relatives in town?" "Someone who—" "My father," Margaret interrupted, her eyes suddenly focused. "He has a ranch. Or had one." "I can't." She pressed her temples. "Why can't I remember?" Jake guided her to Sarah Wheaton's hotel, the only respectable establishment that would accept a woman in her situation. Sarah, a war widow with graying hair and kind eyes, met them at the back entrance. "Jake Sullivan," Sarah said, crossing her arms. "I heard you made an interesting purchase today." "She needs a room, Sarah, and maybe—" Jake looked at Margaret's tattered dress. "Some decent clothes." Sarah studied Margaret with a professional eye. "I can arrange that, but it'll cost." Jake pulled more money from his pouch, leaving only a few coins. "Is this enough for a week?" "2. If she doesn't mind helping in the kitchen." Sarah softened her tone at seeing the desperation in Margaret's eyes. "Come, dear. Let's get you a hot bath and something decent to wear." As Sarah led Margaret inside, the woman turned to Jake. "Why did you do it? Why did you pay for me?" Jake didn't have a ready answer. How to explain the impulse that had led him to spend his savings on a stranger? "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said finally. Margaret nodded slowly, as if that made perfect sense. "My father would have done the same," she murmured before disappearing into the hotel. Jake returned to his mountain cabin that night with an empty purse and a mind full of questions. Who was Margaret Henderson? What had happened to her to end up at that auction, with her mind apparently fragmented? He stoked the fire in his simple stone fireplace and sat in his only chair, a creation of his own making from pine and elk hide. The flames danced, casting shadows that reminded him of other times, other faces. His mother, dead of fever when he was 12. His father, killed at Shiloh. His younger sister Emma, lost somewhere in the chaos after the war. Father. The word echoed in his mind. The way Margaret had said it, with such desperate hope, stirred something deep within him. Jake poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and stared into the fire until sleep finally took him. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Jake woke with the decision already made. He would find out what happened to Margaret Henderson. But first, he needed to work. Without his savings, he'd need every cent he could earn from the lumber contract with the railroad. He was sharpening his axe when he heard horses approaching. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, and Jake's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle leaning against the woodpile. But he relaxed when he recognized Dr. Samuel Morrison's gray beard. "Morning, Jake," the doctor called out, dismounting carefully. At 60, Doc Morrison was one of the few educated men in the territory who didn't put on airs. The 2 men with him Jake didn't recognize hard-looking characters with tied-down guns. "Doc." Jake nodded. "What brings you up here?" Morrison's face was grave. "It's about the woman you bought yesterday." Jake tensed. "What about her?" "I examined her this morning at Sarah's request." The doctor removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly. "Jake, that woman's been through hell. She's got scars, old and new, signs of mistreatment. And her mind." He shook his head. "She's suffering from what we call amnesia. Can't remember much past a few weeks ago." "Who is she, Doc?" "That's what these gentlemen are here about." Morrison gestured to his companions. "This is Frank Dalton and Bill Masterson. They're investigators from the Pinkerton Agency." The taller of the 2, Dalton, stepped forward. "Mr. Sullivan, we've been tracking a missing person case. Margaret Henderson disappeared from her father's ranch near Laramie 3 months ago. Her father, Colonel James Henderson, has been searching for her ever since." Jake's heart jumped. "Colonel Henderson, the cattle baron." "The same," Masterson confirmed. "He's offering $1,000 reward for information leading to his daughter's return." $1,000. More money than Jake had ever seen, but something felt wrong. If she's his daughter, how'd she end up in a debtor's auction? Dalton and Masterson exchanged glances. That's what we're trying to figure out. The debt was registered under her name, but the paperwork. Dalton paused. Let's just say it has some irregularities. Someone wanted her to disappear, Jake said slowly. That's our thinking, Masterson agreed. Mr. Sullivan, we need to take Miss Henderson back to her father. You'll receive the full reward, of course. Jake thought of Margaret's terrified eyes, the way she'd said father like a prayer. I want to talk to her first. The Pinkertons stiffened. That's not necessary, Dalton said. Maybe not, Jake replied, standing to his full height. But she's under my protection, until she tells me otherwise. We'll go together, or not at all. The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut with Jake's axe. The two Pinkerton men sized him up, hands hovering near their weapons. Doc Morrison stepped between them, raising his hands peacefully. Gentlemen, please, the doctor said. We all want what's best for Miss Henderson. Jake, these men have credentials. I've verified them myself. Jake didn't budge. I don't doubt who they are, Doc. But something doesn't sit right. A colonel's daughter doesn't just end up in a debtor's auction by accident. Frank Dalton's jaw tightened. Mr. Sullivan, you're interfering with a legal investigation. Am I? Jake picked up his axe, testing its weight casually. Way I see it, I paid $50 for her debt. That makes her my responsibility, until she says different. Bill Masterson whispered something to his partner. Dalton nodded reluctantly. Fine, we'll all go together. But we leave within the hour. I'll need to gather some supplies, Jake said, and Margaret needs to know what's happening. The ride back to Cheyenne was tense. Jake noticed how the Pinkertons kept their horses positioned to box him in. These weren't just investigators, they were manhunters. And they were nervous about something. At Sarah's hotel, they found Margaret in the kitchen, helping knead bread. She'd been transformed. Clean and wearing a simple blue dress that Sarah had altered to fit her. She looked younger than Jake had first thought. Maybe her blonde hair was pinned up, revealing a graceful neck despite her heavy build. When she saw Jake, her face lit up. Mr. Sullivan, Sarah's been so kind. I've been helping with the cooking, and I remembered something. I know how to make sourdough starter. Isn't that strange? I can remember recipes, but not. Her voice trailed off as she noticed the men behind Jake. The color drained from her face, and she stepped backward, bumping into the stove. Margaret, Jake said gently, moving toward her. These men say they know your father, Colonel James Henderson from Laramie. No, she whispered, shaking her head violently. No, that's not. I don't. Miss Henderson. Dalton stepped forward, reaching into his coat. Margaret screamed and grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it with surprising expertise. Stay back, she cried. Don't touch me. I won't go back. I won't. Everyone froze. Jake slowly moved between Margaret and the Pinkertons. Easy now, he said softly. Nobody's going to force you to do anything. Put the knife down, Margaret. Her hands shook, but her grip on the knife was steady. They're lying, she said. My father wouldn't. He wouldn't send men like them. Men like us. Masterson's voice was cold. What do you mean by that, Miss Henderson? Margaret's eyes darted between them like a trapped animal. I don't know. I just know you're wrong. You're dangerous. Jake made a decision. Sarah, he called to the hotel owner, who was watching from the doorway. Would you please send someone to fetch Sheriff Watson? Tell him we need him here, right? Away. The Pinkertons exchanged dark looks. That's not necessary, Dalton said. I think it is, Jake replied firmly. If Margaret is who you say she is, then having the law present protects everyone. While they waited, Jake kept himself positioned between Margaret and the investigators. She'd lowered the knife but hadn't released it. Her breathing was rapid, panicked. Margaret, Jake said quietly. What do you remember about your father? Her brow furrowed in concentration. He's tall, with gray hair. He smells like pipe tobacco and leather. He used to read to me from the Bible when I was small. Tears started flowing down her cheeks. He called me his little songbird because I loved to sing hymns. That matches Colonel Henderson, Doc Morrison confirmed gently. But these men, Margaret looked at the Pinkertons with terror. I've seen them before, or men like them. In a dark place, she pressed her free hand to her temple. It hurts to remember. Sheriff Watson arrived 20 minutes later, a solid man in his 50s who'd kept the peace in Cheyenne for a decade. He listened to all sides, examined the Pinkertons' credentials, and then turned to Margaret. Miss, I need to ask you straight, the sheriff said. Do you want to go with these men? No, Margaret said immediately. I want to stay with Mr. Sullivan. The sheriff nodded. Jake, you willing to take responsibility for her? I am. Then here's what we're going to do, Watson declared. Jake and Miss Henderson will travel to Laramie to meet with Colonel Henderson. I'll provide a deputy as escort. You Pinkerton boys can follow along, but you keep your distance. If she is the colonel's daughter, we'll let them reunite proper like if she's not. Or if something's amiss, we'll deal with it according to the law. Agreed. The Pinkertons clearly didn't like it, but they had no legal ground to refuse. Agreed, Dalton said through gritted teeth, as the group dispersed to prepare for the journey. Margaret touched Jake's arm. Why are you doing this for me? She asked. You don't even know me. Jake looked into her frightened blue eyes and saw something he recognized. The look of someone who'd been hunted, who'd been at the mercy of those stronger and crueler. Maybe not, he said, but I know what it's like to have nobody in your corner. You've got me now, for whatever that's worth. Margaret's smile was wobbly, but genuine. It's worth everything, Mr. Sullivan. The morning of departure brought the first snow of the season, fat flakes drifting down like ash from heaven. Jake had spent the night preparing, cleaning his Henry rifle, checking his Colt .45, and packing provisions for the 3-day ride to Laramie. He'd also done something he hadn't done in years, written a letter. If something happened to him, Tom Wheeler would know, to send it to his aunt in Missouri. Margaret waited at the hotel, bundled in a heavy coat Sarah had provided. The transformation in her appearance continued to amaze Jake. Clean and properly dressed, she carried herself with an unconscious dignity that spoke of good breeding. But her eyes remained haunted, darting constantly to shadows and doorways. Deputy Marcus Reed, a competent young man Jake had known since he was a boy, would serve as their official escort. The Pinkertons had camped outside town and would shadow their group at a distance. As agreed. You sure about this, Jake? Sarah asked as they loaded the wagon Jake had borrowed. Margaret couldn't, or wouldn't, ride horseback, another mystery. In a growing list, no, Jake admitted. But I gave my word. The first day's travel took them through the rolling hills, southeast of Cheyenne. Margaret sat beside Jake on the wagon seat, while Deputy Reed rode alongside. The snow had stopped, but the sky remained heavy with the promise of more. They'd gone perhaps 10 miles when Margaret suddenly grabbed Jake's arm. That ridge, she whispered, pointing to a line of rocks ahead. I've been here before. Jake pulled the wagon to a stop. You remember? Not exactly. She climbed down from the wagon and walked toward the rocks, moving as if in a trance. Jake and Reed followed, hands near their weapons. Margaret stopped at a distinctive formation. 3 boulders leaning together like old men in conversation. She knelt and began digging in the sandy soil with her bare hands. Margaret, what are you doing? Jake asked. I left it here, she muttered. I knew I'd forget, so I left it here. Her fingers found something wrapped in oilcloth. With shaking hands, she unwrapped a small leather journal. As she opened it, Jake saw pages covered in neat feminine handwriting. Margaret read the first entry, her face going pale. Oh God, she breathed. Oh God, it's true. What's true? Deputy Reed demanded. Margaret looked up at them with tears streaming down her face. I wrote this 3 months ago. Listen, if you're reading this, then they've made you forget. Your name is Margaret Elizabeth Henderson. Your father is Colonel James Henderson, and the men who took you are the shot came from nowhere. The journal exploding from Margaret's hands. Jake threw himself over her, pulling her behind the rocks as more shots rang out. Reed had his rifle out, returning fire at muzzle flashes on the opposite ridge. Stay down, Jake ordered Margaret, then scrambled to the wagon for his Henry. He'd counted 3 shooters, maybe 4. Professional work. They'd been waiting. The firefight was brief but vicious. Jake's military training came flooding back as he laid down covering fire, allowing Reed to flank the attacker's position. When the shooting stopped, 2 men lay dead on the ridge. The others had fled on horseback. You hit? Jake asked Margaret, checking her for wounds. She shook her head, then looked at the destroyed journal. Only a few scorched pages remained. They didn't want me to remember, she said numbly. Reed returned, his face grim. I recognize one of them. Will Tucker, gun, for hire out of Denver. Someone paid good money for this ambush. Jake heard horses approaching fast. The Pinkertons, drawn by the gunfire. They reined up hard, taking in the scene. What happened? Dalton demanded. Ambush, Jake said coldly. Funny how they knew exactly where we'd be. Masterson's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting something, Sullivan? I'm suggesting we change our route, Jake replied. And that may be you to ride where we can see you from now on. Margaret had retrieved the few remaining pages of her journal. One fragment was still partially readable. Drugged me. Sold to pay a false debt. Uncle Richard wants the ranch. Trust no one except the rest was gone. Uncle Richard, Jake asked gently. Margaret's memories were returning in painful fragments. My father's brother. He's always wanted the ranch. But father would never sell. She looked at the Pinkertons with new understanding. You don't work for my father at all, do you? Dalton's hand moved toward his gun. Reed's rifle was faster, centering on the Pinkerton's chest. I'd think real careful about your next move, the deputy said. We work for whoever pays us, Dalton admitted. Right now, that's Colonel Henderson. Whether that's your father or your uncle, well, he shrugged. That's not our concern. Jake made another decision. Reed, I want you to ride back to Cheyenne. Wire the federal marshal in Denver. Tell him we've got attempted murder, kidnapping, and fraud. Then catch up with us on the old military road. What about them? Reed gestured to the pink. They can come along peacefully, or we can leave them here, trussed up for the marshal. Their choice. The Pinkertons chose to come along, but Jake kept them under watch. As they changed route to the old military road, Margaret huddled close to him on the wagon seat. Jake, she said quietly. That journal entry. There was more. I remember writing it now. The part about trusting no one, except, she paused, color rising in her cheeks, except the kind man who would save me. I wrote that I'd know him by his red beard and gentle hands. I thought I was going mad when I wrote it, but, Jake's throat tightened. How could you know? I didn't, Margaret said simply. But my mother always said God works in mysterious ways. Maybe he sent me a vision of you. She managed a small smile. Or maybe it's just coincidence. Either way, I'm glad you were there. The old military road was rough and rarely used, since the railroad had made it obsolete. Jake chose it precisely for that reason. Harder to ambush on unfamiliar ground. They made camp in a defensible position near Lodgepole Creek, with good sight lines in all directions. As Jake tended the horses, he noticed Margaret sitting apart from the others, studying the remaining fragments of her journal by firelight. The Pinkertons kept to themselves, under Deputy Reed's watchful eye. Find anything useful? Jake asked, settling beside her. Margaret showed him a partially burnt page. Look at this. It's a deed transfer, or part of one. My signature, but I don't remember signing it. Jake examined the document. Despite the damage, he could make out enough to understand its significance. This would give your uncle control of your father's ranch if anything happened to you both. But I'm alive, Margaret protested. Are you? Jake asked gently. Legally, I mean, you were sold as a debtor. Your name's on auction records. If your father's dead and you're declared incompetent or criminal, Margaret's face went white. Oh, God. My father. What if they've already? She stood abruptly, swaying. Jake caught her arm. We don't know anything yet, he said firmly. Tomorrow, we'll reach Laramie. We'll find the truth. That night, Jake took the first watch. The snow had started again, muffling all sound except the creek's quiet gurgle. He was thinking about Margaret's strange premonition when he heard it. The soft click of a hammer being drawn back. Jake rolled sideways as the shot split the air where he'd been sitting. His Henry was in his hands before the echo faded, and he fired at the muzzle flash. A cry of pain rewarded his effort. Reed, Jake shouted. Watch the Pinkertons. More shots came from different directions. This wasn't a random attack, it was coordinated, professional. Jake belly-crawled to better cover, trying to count shooters. Margaret screamed. Jake whipped around to see Dalton dragging her toward the horses, while Masterson held Reed at gunpoint. The deputy's rifle lay in the snow. Drop it, Sullivan, Masterson called. It's over. Jake stood slowly, his rifle trained on Dalton. Let her go. Can't do that, Dalton replied, pressing his pistol to Margaret's temple. She's worth too much. Alive, though dead works too, if you force it. How much is Richard Henderson paying you? Jake asked, buying time while calculating angles. More than you'll see in 10 lifetimes, Masterson laughed. The old colonel's been dead 2 weeks. Heart attack, real tragic. Richard just needs his niece to sign some papers or have an accident. Either works. Margaret found her voice. My father's dead as a doornail, Dalton confirmed. Buried him quick and quiet. Richard's been running things, waiting for us to deliver you. Jake saw Margaret's face change. The frightened, confused woman vanished, replaced by something harder. You killed him, she said quietly. Nah, that was God's work. Dalton chuckled. Though the digitalis in his brandy might have helped the Lord along. It happened fast. Margaret went limp, her dead weight catching Dalton off guard. As his aim wavered, she drove her elbow into his solar plexus with surprising force. Jake's rifle boomed, catching Masterson's center mass. Reed dove for his weapon as Dalton tried to recover, but Margaret was already moving. She grabbed the skinning knife from Dalton's own belt and drove it up under his ribs. The Pinkerton stared at her in shock as he collapsed. Margaret stood over him, blood on her hands, her face eerily calm. I remember now, she said conversationally. You were there, at the ranch. You held me while they forced the drugs down my throat. You laughed when I begged for my father. More gunfire erupted from the darkness. The other attackers, moving in. Jake grabbed Margaret and pushed her behind the wagon. Reed, how many? 4, maybe 5, the deputy called back, firing rapidly. They were outnumbered and outflanked. Jake made a quick decision. Margaret, can you ride? I think so. If I have to, you have to. Jake whistled sharply. Thunder came running, followed by the other horses. Reed, covering fire. What followed was chaos. Jake lifted Margaret onto Thunder's back, then swung up behind her. Reed leaped onto his own mount. As bullets whined past, they charged through the attacker's line. Jake firing his pistol one-handed while controlling the horse with the other. Margaret clung to Thunder's mane, her dress billowing in the wind. Jake could feel her trembling, but she didn't cry out. Even when a bullet creased her shoulder, they rode hard through the snowy darkness, putting distance between themselves and the ambush. Finally, Jake pulled up near a cluster of rocks, listening for pursuit. You're hurt, he said, seeing blood on Margaret's dress. It's nothing, she gasped. Jake, my father, he's really dead. We don't know for sure. They could be lying. But in his heart, Jake suspected it was true. This whole elaborate scheme, the false debt, the drugging, the auction, it all pointed to a carefully planned murder and theft. Reed caught up with them, his horse lathered with sweat. We can't go to Laramie, he panted. If Richard Henderson controls the town, Fort Laramie, Jake decided. The army garrison, they'll have a telegraph, and Richard can't buy off the entire U.S. cavalry. Margaret leaned back against Jake's chest. I killed him, she said quietly. Dalton, I killed him. You defended yourself, Jake said firmly. He would have murdered you. No, you don't understand. Margaret's voice was strange, distant. I remembered how. The movements, the training. My father made sure I could protect myself. He said a woman alone in the frontier needed to know such things. But I'd forgotten, along with everything else. Fort Laramie emerged from the pre-dawn darkness like a fortress of civilization against the wilderness. The sentries challenged them at the gates, but Deputy Reed's badge got them through. Within minutes, they were in the commander's office, telling their story to Major Thomas Brennan, a gray-haired veteran with shrewd eyes. That's quite a tale, Brennan said when they finished. He studied Margaret, who sat wrapped in a military blanket, her shoulder bandaged by the fort surgeon. You're certain about Colonel Henderson being murdered? The Pinkertons admitted it, Red confirmed. Said they used digitalis in his brandy. Brennan's face darkened. James Henderson was a friend. We served together in the war. He called for his aide. Wired Denver. I want federal marshals here within 2 days, and send a detail to the Henderson ranch immediately. Sir, the aide said. There's already been a wire about the ranch. Came in yesterday. Fire destroyed the main house 3 nights ago. Colonel Henderson reportedly died trying to save his papers from the study. Margaret made a small, wounded sound. Jake took her hand without thinking, and she gripped it tightly. Convenient, Brennan said grimly. Any survivors? The foreman, Miguel Santana, and most of the hands. They're holding at the bunkhouse. Refusing to take orders from Richard Henderson. Margaret's head snapped up. Miguel's alive. He's been with father for 20 years. He'll know the truth. We'll ride out at first light, Brennan decided. With a full cavalry escort. Mr. Sullivan, Deputy Reed, I'll need you both to come. The next hours passed in a blur. Margaret was given quarters in the officer's family section, with the commander's wife to attend her. Jake found himself unable to sleep, pacing the fort's walls as dawn approached. Everything had happened so fast. 5 days ago, he'd been a simple lumberjack. And now, can't sleep either. Margaret's voice startled him. She'd climbed the ladder to the wall walk, moving carefully with her wounded shoulder. You should be resting, Jake said. I've remembered more. She joined him at the parapet, looking out at the lightning sky. The night they took me, Father had received threats. He sent most of the servants away, kept only his most trusted men. But Uncle Richard had a key. He'd always had a key. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. They came at dinner. Father thought he was still strong for his age. But there were too many. They held him while Richard forced something down my throat. The last thing I remember clearly is Father shouting my name. I'm sorry, Jake said, knowing how inadequate the words were. The strange thing is, Margaret continued, I remember other things now too. Happy things. Father teaching me to shoot. My mother singing in the garden before she died. Christmas dinners with the Hands and their families. She smiled sadly. I even remember why I was so afraid of horses. Why, when I was 8, I fell from my pony and broke my arm. Father was so frightened he forbade me to ride again. Said he couldn't lose me like he'd lost Mother. She laughed softly. Ironic, isn't it? His protection made me vulnerable. The sun crested the horizon, painting the snow-covered plains gold. Jake found himself studying Margaret's profile, seeing past the plain features to the strength underneath. Why are you looking at me like that? She asked. Jake felt heat rise in his face. Just thinking, you're not the same woman I bought at that. Oxen no, Margaret agreed. That woman was broken, lost. But you, she turned to face him fully. You gave her dignity when the world wanted to strip it away. You stood between her and danger when you had no obligation to. Why? Jake struggled to find words. How could he explain the pull he'd felt, the sense of recognition? My mother used to say that God puts people in our path for a reason. I stopped believing that when I lost my family. But maybe, he paused. Maybe some part of me recognized that you needed help, and I could give it. Margaret reached up and touched his bearded cheek. Jake Sullivan, I believe you're the best man I've ever known. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Then boots clattered on the ladder, and Deputy Reed's head appeared. Major Brennan's ready to ride. The spell broke. Margaret stepped back, color high in her cheeks. We should go. The ride to the Henderson Ranch took 4 hours through country that grew increasingly familiar to Margaret. She rode in an army wagon this time, flanked by 20 cavalry. Jake rode alongside on Thunder, rifle across his saddle. As they crested the final ridge, Margaret gasped. Below lay a prosperous ranch, but the main house was a blackened ruin. Only the stone chimneys stood like grave markers against the sky. Home, Margaret whispered that they were met at the gate by a wiry Mexican man with silver temples and hard eyes. When he saw Margaret, his face transformed. Señorita Margaret. Gracias a Dios. Miguel Santana embraced her carefully, tears on his weathered cheeks. We thought you were dead. Nearly was, Margaret said. Miguel, my father. The foreman's face darkened. Come, I show you. He led them to a small cemetery on a hill overlooking the valley. A fresh grave stood beside an older one marked Elizabeth Morrison Henderson, beloved wife and mother. Margaret fell to her knees beside her father's grave. Jake stood back, giving her privacy for her grief, but she reached for his hand, pulling him down beside her. He's really gone, she said brokenly. Miguel knelt on her other side. Sib, but he did not die, as they say. The colonel, he was healthy like a bull. Then Mr. Richard comes to visit, and suddenly the colonel is sick. Very sick. I try to call doctor, but Mr. Richard says no need. Murder, Major Brennan said grimly. So, the night the colonel died, I was in the barn. I see Mr. Richard in the study, burning papers. Then suddenly, the whole house is on fire. They say the colonel died trying to save his documents, but I know better. The colonel was already dead. Will you testify to that? Brennan asked, but Miguel nodded firmly. For Senorita Margaret, anything. As they stood to leave the cemetery, Jake noticed movement near the burned house. A man emerged from behind a standing wall, tall, well-dressed, despite the early hour, with cold gray eyes that reminded Jake of a snake. Hello, niece, Richard Henderson called. I heard you'd been found. How fortunate. The cavalrymen reached for their weapons, but Richard raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. Now, no need for violence. I'm here to make you an offer, Margaret. Sign the ranch over to me, and I'll give you enough money to live comfortably anywhere you choose. Refuse. He smiled coldly. Well, accidents happen. Even surrounded by soldiers, accidents happen. Margaret stepped forward, Jake moving instinctively beside her. When she spoke, her voice was steady as granite. Uncle Richard, I remember everything now. The drugs, the lies, the murder. You killed my father for this land, and now you threaten me. She smiled, and Jake saw her father's steel in it. You forgot something. I'm a Henderson too. This is my land, my people, and I'll see you hang before I give you one handful of dirt. Richard's face turned purple with rage. But before he could speak again, the thunder of approaching hooves made everyone turn. Deputy Reed was returning from Cheyenne, and with him rode a dozen men, federal marshals, their badges glinting in the morning sun. Federal Marshal Tom Garrett, the lead rider, announced, dismounting with practiced ease. He was a weathered man in his 40s, with eyes that had seen too much. We received Deputy Reed's wire about murder, kidnapping, and fraud. His gaze fixed on Richard Henderson. Would you be Richard Henderson? Richard's composure cracked slightly. I am. And I demand to know why armed federals are trespassing on my property. Your property. Margaret's voice cut through the morning air. This ranch belongs to me, Marshal. My father left it to me, and this man murdered him for it. Marshal Garrett studied the burned ruins of the main house. Convenient fire. Mind if my men poke around the ashes? I most certainly do mind, Richard blustered. You have no warrant, no authority. Actually, Garrett pulled a paper from his coat. Judge Morton in Denver disagreed. This warrant gives us full authority to investigate the death of Colonel James Henderson and the alleged kidnapping of his daughter. Richard's hand twitched toward his coat. 3 marshals had their guns half drawn before he could blink. Easy there, Garrett said, mildly. Why don't you step over here, where we can talk proper like? As the marshals led Richard away, Margaret sagged against Jake. He caught her, feeling how she trembled with delayed reaction. It's almost over, he murmured. Is it? She looked up at him with those blue eyes that had haunted him since the auction. He has money, influence. What if Miss Henderson? Marshal Garrett had returned. We found something you should see. In the ruins of the study, partially protected by a fallen beam, lay a metal strongbox. The lock had been broken, but inside were documents that had survived the fire. Your father was a careful man, Garrett said, handing Margaret a leather folder. Looks like he suspected his brother might try something. With shaking hands, Margaret opened the folder. Inside was her father's will, properly witnessed and dated just 2 months before his death. But it was the accompanying letter that made her gasp. My dearest Margaret, she read aloud, her voice catching. If you are reading this, then my fears have come true. Your Uncle Richard has long coveted our land, and I believe he means to take it by any means. I have taken precautions. The ranch and all my holdings are yours, held in trust by Major Thomas Brennan, until you marry or reach 30 years of age. Under no circumstances can Richard inherit. I have also hidden proof of his past crimes in the old mineshaft where he used to play as a child. Remember, my songbird, you are stronger than you know. Your loving father, James. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. Jake wanted to comfort her, but held back, aware of all the watching eyes. The old mine, Miguel said suddenly. Sir, I know. This place. The Colonel, he'd go there sometimes. Always alone. Can you take us there? Garrett asked. The mine was a half-hour ride into the hills. As they approached, Richard Henderson broke his silence. This is ridiculous. You're chasing the fantasies of a grief-stricken woman. Then you won't mind us looking, Garrett replied. The shaft was partially collapsed, but stable enough to enter. In a hidden alcove, they found another strongbox. This one contained letters, photographs, and most damning, a signed confession from a man named William Morse. I'll be damned, Garrett whistled. Morse was killed in a robbery 5 years ago. Says here, Richard Henderson paid him to poison a business rival in Denver. He looked at Richard, whose face had gone gray. That's a hanging offense. Lies, Richard shouted. Forgeries. You can't prove your father knew, Margaret said quietly. He kept this to protect me, didn't he? Insurance against you. Richard's mask finally shattered completely. That's sanctimonious. Fool. He had everything. The ranch, the respect, the perfect daughter. And what did I have? Nothing. I was smarter, stronger, but he was the eldest. He got it all, just for being born first. So you killed him, Jake said. Richard laughed bitterly. He was dying anyway. Weak heart, the doctor said. I just hastened things. And you, he pointed at Margaret, you should have stayed lost. Stupid cow, just like your mother. Margaret moved so fast, even Jake was surprised. Her fist connected with Richard's jaw with all the force of her considerable weight behind it. Richard went down hard, blood streaming from his nose. That's for my father, she said calmly. And my mother. And for trying to steal my life. Marshal Garrett hid a smile as his men hauled Richard to his feet. Richard Henderson, you're under arrest for murder, kidnapping, fraud, and about 6 other charges I'll think of on the ride back. As they led Richard away in irons, Major Brennan approached Margaret. Your father's will names me as trustee, but I think you're more than capable of running this ranch yourself. I'll sign whatever papers needed to give you full control. Thank you, Major. Margaret looked around at the ruins of her childhood home, then at the vast lands stretching beyond. There's so much to rebuild. You won't be alone, Miguel said firmly. The men, we stay. We help you make it great again. Margaret nodded, then turned to Jake. And you, will you stay? Jake's heart hammered, but he kept his voice steady. I've got a lumber contract to finish. The railroad, I could use a good lumber supplier, Margaret interrupted. For rebuilding, I'll match whatever the railroad's paying. More, even. Margaret. Jake struggled with the words. I'm just a lumberjack. You're a wealthy rancher now. You don't need stop. She stepped close, ignoring their audience. You saved me when I was nothing. When everyone saw trash to be used and discarded, you saw a person worth protecting. You think I care about money or status? She touched his face gently. I care about the man who gave me back my life. Jake covered her hand with his. I'm not going anywhere, he said softly. Around them, Miguel and the ranch hands cheered. Even the federal marshals were grinning. Major Brennan cleared his throat. Well then, the major said. Let's get back to the fort. We have reports to file, and a ranch to start rebuilding. As they prepared to leave, Jake helped Margaret into the wagon. You know, he said, when I bought you at that auction, I thought I was saving you. You did, Margaret said. No, Jake shook his head. I think you saved me. I'd been alone so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to care about someone else's. Tomorrow, Margaret squeezed his hand. Then we saved each other. The next weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. With Richard in custody, awaiting trial, Margaret threw herself into rebuilding the ranch. Jake divided his time between his lumber camp and the Henderson spread, supervising the construction of a new main house. It was smaller than the original, but Margaret insisted on practical overgrand. I want a home, not a monument, she told Jake as they reviewed the plans one evening. They sat in the foreman's cabin that served as temporary headquarters. Maps and blueprints spread across Miguel's kitchen table. You sure about this? Jake pointed to a section of the design. Moving the kitchen closer to the dining room makes sense, but it'll cost more in plumbing. Margaret smiled, spoken like a man who's never had to carry hot food through 3 rooms and a hallway. Trust me, it's worth it. Jake found himself smiling back. In the weeks since Richard's arrest, Margaret had transformed. The frightened, confused woman from the auction was gone, replaced by someone confident and capable. She rode horses now, having overcome her childhood fear through sheer determination. She managed the ranch hands with a firm but fair hand, and her memory had returned completely. Well, almost completely. Jake, she said suddenly, setting down her pencil. There's something I need to tell you. About that journal entry. He knew immediately what she meant. The destroyed journal, her strange premonition about a red-bearded man who would save her. I lied, she said quietly. Not about writing it, but about when. I didn't write it before they took me. I wrote it after. Jake frowned. I don't understand. Neither did I at first. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the sunset, painting the mountains crimson. But I've been remembering those lost weeks. The drugs they gave me, they didn't just confuse my mind. They gave me visions, dreams that felt more real than reality. She turned back to him. I dreamed of you, Jake, over and over. A red-bearded man with gentle hands who would buy me at an auction. I thought I was going mad. So when they left me alone for a few minutes, I wrote it down. A message to myself, or maybe a prayer. Jake's skeptical nature warred with the evidence before him. That's impossible. Is it? Margaret asked. My mother's people were Irish. She always said the women in her family had the sight. I never believed it. But, she shrugged. How else do you explain it? Before Jake could answer, Miguel burst through the door. Senorita, riders coming. Many riders. Jake grabbed his rifle and followed Margaret outside. In the fading light, they could see a dozen horsemen approaching, but as they drew closer, Jake relaxed. These weren't threats, they were neighbors. Margaret Henderson, the lead rider, a dignified woman in her 60s, dismounted with surprising agility. I'm Catherine Morrison. I own the Double M Ranch to the south. Your father and I were friends. More introductions followed. The neighboring ranchers had come to pay their respects and offer support. Word of Richard's crimes had spread, and the community was rallying around Margaret. "Your father was a good man," said Robert Chase, a gruff cattleman with hands like leather. "Helped me through a bad drought 5 years back. I owe his daughter the same courtesy." As Margaret served coffee and Miguel's wife Maria brought out food, Jake watched the rancher's initial skepticism melt away. Margaret might be young and female, but she knew cattle and grass and water rights. She spoke their language. "Course, you'll be needing a husband soon," Catherine Morrison said bluntly. "A woman alone, even a capable one, faces challenges out here." Jake tensed, but Margaret's response surprised him. "Perhaps, but I'll not marry for convenience, Mrs. Morrison. When I marry, it'll be for love." Her eyes found Jake's across that room, and the message was clear. Several of the ranchers followed her gaze, and knowing smiles appeared. "Well now," Chase said, studying Jake with new interest. "You're the lumberjack who bought her at the auction. Heard about that. Takes a particular kind of man to do what you did." "It was the right thing," Jake said uncomfortably. "Maybe so, but most men wouldn't have seen it." Chase extended his hand. "You ever want to run cattle instead of cutting trees, you let me know." The gathering lasted well into the night. As the ranchers prepared to leave, each made concrete offers of help, lumber, labor, breeding stock. The frontier might be harsh, but it bred a certain loyalty among those who survived it. Catherine Morrison was the last to go. She pulled Margaret aside, but Jake could hear her words. "You're a young man there, he's got good bones. Reminds me of my late husband. Quiet, but solid as mountain granite." "He's not my young man," Margaret protested. "Not yet," Catherine said, with a knowing smile. "But any fool can see what's between you. Don't let pride or propriety keep you from happiness, girl. Life's too short and too hard out here for such foolishness." After the guests left, Margaret and Jake stood alone in the yard. The moon had risen, full and bright, turning the snow-covered ground to silver. "Thank you," Margaret said suddenly. "For what?" "For not running when I told you about the visions. Most men would think me mad." Jake considered his words carefully. "I've seen too much to dismiss anything outright. During the war, I saw men know things they couldn't know, felt dangers they couldn't see. Maybe your mother's people were right about the sight." Margaret stepped closer. "And maybe it brought me you." The moment hung between them, charged with possibility. Jake knew he should step back, maintain the proper distance between employer and employee. Instead, he found himself reaching out to touch her face. "Margaret," he said softly, "I'm not the kind of man a woman like you should." She silenced him by pressing her fingers to his lips. "Stop telling me what I should want. I know my own mind, Jake Sullivan. I knew it the moment you took that sack off my head and looked at me like I was worth saving." Jake's resistance crumbled. He pulled her close and kissed her, pouring weeks of held-back longing into the contact. Margaret responded with equal fervor, her arms winding round his neck. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Well," Margaret said, a shy smile playing at her lips, "that was worth waiting for." Jake laughed, surprising himself. When was the last time he'd laughed freely? "Your neighbors will talk. Let them," Margaret said firmly. "I've been gossiped about since the day I was dragged onto that auction platform. At least now they'll have something true to say." As they walked back toward the cabin, Jake felt something shift inside him. The walls he'd built after losing his family, the isolation he'd wrapped around himself like armor, it was all crumbling under Margaret's steady assault. "Stay," she said suddenly. "Not in the bunkhouse. Here, with me." Jake's body responded to the invitation, but his honor held him back. "Margaret, you're a lady. I won't compromise your reputation more than it already has been." She sighed but nodded. "Ever the gentleman." "Very well, Mr. Sullivan. But know this, I'm a determined woman, and I've decided I want you for my husband." "Is that a proposal?" Jake asked, amused despite himself. "It's a declaration of intent," Margaret said primly. "The proposal will come when you're ready to say yes." As Jake walked to the bunkhouse that night, he found himself grinning like a fool. 6 weeks ago, he'd been a lonely lumberjack with nothing but his axe and his solitude. Now he had, what love, the possibility of family, a future that held more than just endless days of cutting wood. The thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Richard Henderson's trial began on a cold December morning in Denver. Margaret insisted on attending, and Jake wouldn't let her go alone. They took the train, A novel experience for Margaret despite her wealth. I've lived here all my life and never ridden the railroad, she marveled, watching the landscape flash by. Father always preferred carriages. Jake sat beside her in the private compartment, acutely aware of the propriety they maintained in public. The past month had been a dance of stolen moments and careful distances. Their relationship was an open secret on the ranch, but Margaret insisted on discretion elsewhere. Are you sure you want to do this? Jake asked as Denver's buildings came into view. Testifying won't be easy. Margaret's jaw set stubbornly. He killed my father. I need to see justice done. The trial was a sensation. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curiosity seekers, all eager to hear the story of the wealthy rancher who'd murdered his brother and sold his niece into servitude. Jake had to use his size to clear a path for Margaret through the crowd. Richard, in chains and prison gray, looked smaller than Jake remembered. His expensive lawyers had abandoned him once the evidence mounted. The public defender assigned to him looked overwhelmed. When Margaret took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, describing her kidnapping, the forced drugs, waking up with no memory. Her voice only broke once, when she described learning of her father's death. The defendant told me my father died of a heart attack, she said. He laughed when he said the digitalis in father's brandy helped God along. The prosecutor presented the evidence found in the mine, documents proving Richard's past murders, correspondence with the corrupt bank officials who'd created Margaret's false debt. The Pinkerton survivors offered immunity, testified about Richard's elaborate plan. But it was Miguel Santana's testimony that sealed Richard's fate. The foreman described watching Richard burn papers while the house blazed around him, seeing him emerge from the study just before the fire started. The colonel, he was already dead, Miguel said firmly. I know this because I helped prepare his body. No smoke in his lungs. He did not die in the fire. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. As the judge pronounced the death sentence, Richard finally looked at Margaret. You stupid girl, he said. You have no idea what you've inherited. That ranch will destroy you like it destroyed your father. No, Margaret said quietly. It won't. Because unlike you, I understand that land is meant to be stewarded, not owned. And unlike you, I'm not alone. Her hand found Jake's, and this time she didn't care who saw. They stayed in Denver 2 more days, finalizing legal matters. Margaret was now one of the wealthiest women in the territory. Her father's hidden investments, adding substantially to the ranch's value. She insisted on setting aside funds for the families Richard had destroyed over the years. On their last night, they dined at the Brown Palace Hotel. Margaret wore a new dress of deep blue silk that brought out her eyes. Jake, uncomfortable in his borrowed suit, couldn't stop staring. You're beautiful, he said impulsively. Margaret blushed. I'm the same woman you bought at that auction, just in better clothes. No, Jake said seriously. You're not the same at all. That woman was lost. You've found yourself. After dinner, they walked through the snowy streets. Denver was stringing electric lights for Christmas, and the effect was magical. Jake, Margaret said suddenly, there's something I need to tell you about my father's will. Jake's stomach clenched. Here it comes, he thought. The provision that she marries someone of her own class. Major Brennan explained all the details yesterday. Father put in a clause about marriage. If I marry before I'm 30, my husband gains ownership of the ranch. I see, Jake said stiffly. No, I don't think you do. Margaret stopped walking, forcing him to face her. Father did that to protect me from fortune hunters. But it also means I need to be very sure about who I marry, because I'll be giving him half of everything. Margaret, I don't want your money. I know, she interrupted. That's why I want to give it to you. Well, half of it anyway. She took a deep breath. Jake Sullivan, will you marry me? Jake stared at her, speechless. Around them, citizens hurried past, bundled against the cold. I know it's not conventional, Margaret continued, her confidence wavering at his silence. But nothing about us has been conventional. You saved me when I was nothing. You protected me when I was helpless. You stood by me when I found my strength. I love you, Jake. And I hope, you love me too. Jake found his voice. Margaret, I'm a lumberjack. I've got no education beyond 6th grade. No family name. No connections. You could marry anyone. Don't want anyone. I want you. Tears glittered in her eyes. But if you don't feel the same, Jake silenced her with a kiss, right there on the busy street. Let Denver's society matrons faint. Let the reporters write their scandalized stories. He was tired of fighting what he felt. "Yes," he said when they broke apart. "Yes, I'll marry you. Though God knows you could do better." "There is no better," Margaret said fiercely. "There's only you." They were married a week later at the ranch, with Miguel and Maria as witnesses, and half the county in attendance. Jake had worried about accepting charity, but Margaret's neighbors made it clear they saw him as one of them now. He'd proven himself through actions, not words. The frontier way. Catherine Morrison summed it up best. "Any fool can be born to money. It takes a real man to do what's right when there's no profit in it." The wedding was simple but joyful. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit. Jake wore his one good suit. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them man and wife, the cheer that went up could be heard in the next valley. That night, in the bedroom of the foreman's cabin, the new house wouldn't be finished for months. Jake held his wife and marveled at the turns life could take. "No regrets?" Margaret asked, tracing patterns on his chest. "Only one," Jake said. She stiffened. "What?" "I should have bid $60 at that auction. You were worth more than 50. Margaret's laughter filled the room, rich and warm as honey. "Jake Sullivan, you romantic fool." "You're romantic fool," he corrected, pulling her close. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. But inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Jake and Margaret were warm. Spring came early to Wyoming that year, melting the snow and turning the range into a carpet of green grass and wildflowers. The new house was nearly complete, and Margaret's pregnancy was beginning to show. Jake still couldn't quite believe it. In 6 months, he'd gone from solitary lumberjack to husband and expectant father. He was supervising the installation of windows when Tom Wheeler arrived from Cheyenne, his face grave. "Jake, we need to talk privately." They walked to the barn, away from the construction crew. Tom pulled out a worn envelope. "This came to the general store. No return address, but it's marked urgent." Jake recognized the handwriting immediately, though he hadn't seen it in 15 years. His sister Emma's delicate script was unmistakable. "Dear Jake," he read aloud, "I pray this finds you. I've searched for so long. I'm in trouble and need your help. Please come to San Francisco. Your loving sister, Emma." Jake's hands shook. Emma, alive after all these years. He'd searched after the war, but the chaos of reconstruction had swallowed all traces of her. "You going?" Tom asked. "I have to." Jake looked toward the house where Margaret was consulting with the painters. "But Margaret will understand," Tom finished. "That woman loves you fierce, Jake. She'll want you to find your sister." Margaret's reaction surprised him. Instead of worry or anger, her face lit up. "Your sister? Oh, Jake, this is wonderful. When do we leave?" Margaret, you're 4 months pregnant. The journey will be fine. Women have been having babies on the frontier for generations." She took his face in her hands. "Jake Sullivan, if you think I'm letting you reunite with your only family without me, you're mad." 3 days later, they boarded the Union Pacific, leaving Miguel in charge of the ranch. The journey to San Francisco took 5 days, through landscapes that changed from prairie to desert to mountains to finally, the blue expanse of the Pacific. Emma had included an address, a boarding house in a shabby part of the city. Jake's anxiety grew as they approached. What kind of trouble was she in? The landlady, a sour-faced woman with suspicious eyes, barely glanced at Emma's name. "Room 12, 3rd floor. She's behind on rent, so if you're family, you can settle her account." Jake paid without argument. They climbed narrow stairs that reeked of cabbage and despair. At room 12, Jake knocked softly. "Emma, it's Jake." The door flew open. For a moment, Jake couldn't reconcile the thin, worn woman with the laughing girl he remembered. But then she smiled, and he saw his sister in the expression. "Jake." Emma threw herself into his arms, sobbing. "I knew you'd come. I knew it." Over tea in their hotel suite, Margaret had insisted on the palace. Emma told her story. After the war, she'd been taken in by a reverend's family. Married at 17 to a shopkeeper who died of influenza 5 years later, leaving her with debts. She'd worked as a seamstress, a teacher, whatever she could find. "But then I met Charles," she said, her face darkening. "Charles Morrison. He promised marriage, respectability. I believed him." The old story. Jake's fists clenched, but Margaret's hand on his arm calmed him. "He left when I told him about the baby," Emma continued. "His real wife appeared at my door. Apparently, I was just his San Francisco entertainment." "Where is he now?" Jake's voice was dangerously quiet. "Gone back to Chicago. But that's not the worst part." Emma pulled out a document. He tricked me into signing papers. Claimed they were for wedding preparations. They were actually promissory notes. I owed $3,000 to his associates. Fraud, Margaret said immediately. We'll hire lawyers. No. Emma's voice was sharp with fear. These aren't the kind of men who respect law. They've threatened. If I don't pay. She touched her stomach, where the slight swell of pregnancy showed. Jake stood abruptly. Where do I find them? Jake, no. Emma pleaded. There are too many, and they're dangerous. So am I, Jake said grimly. But it was Margaret who surprised them both. We'll pay, she said simply. $3,000 to make this go away. Done. Emma stared. I can't. Who are you? Your sister-in-law, Margaret said warmly. And we take care of family. The next day, accompanied by 2 Pinkerton agents Margaret hired from a different agency than Richard's, she assured Jake they met with Charles Morrison's associates. The men were exactly what Jake expected. Well-dressed thugs who used words like interest and penalties to justify extortion. Margaret handled them like she handled difficult cattle buyers. Gentlemen, here's my offer. $3,000 cash to settle all debts and claims. In return, you sign this document releasing Mrs. Sullivan from all obligations and agreeing to never contact her again. Sullivan, the lead thug, frowned. Her name's Parker. Was Parker, Jake corrected, standing behind Margaret's chair. She's coming home with us. Something in Jake's eyes made the men reconsider any thoughts of negotiation. They took the money and signed the papers. As they left the meeting, Emma broke down. I can never repay you. You already have, Margaret said, linking arms with her sister-in-law. You've given Jake back his family, and me, a sister. They stayed in San Francisco another week, outfitting Emma with new clothes and arranging her affairs. The transformation was remarkable. With hope restored, Emma bloomed back into the vibrant woman she'd been. On the train home, the 3 of them shared a compartment. Emma couldn't stop marveling at the comfort, the space, the sheer impossibility of her rescue. I'd given up, she admitted one evening as the train crossed the Rockies. When Charles left, when the debts mounted, I thought about... She touched her belly, but the baby deserved a chance. You both do, Jake said firmly. At the ranch, you'll have work if you want it, or just rest, whatever you need. Emma studied her brother, then Margaret. You love her. It wasn't a question, but Jake answered anyway. More than I knew was possible. Good, Emma said. You were alone too long, Jake. After Mama died, after Papa, you tried so hard to take care of me. I'm glad someone's taking care of you now. Margaret blushed but squeezed Jake's hand. We take care of each other. As the train carried them home, Jake reflected on the strange paths life took. A year ago, he'd been alone, convinced that solitude was his fate. Now he had a wife, a coming child, a sister restored to him. All because he'd spent $50 at an auction on a woman who said, "Father, what are you thinking?" Margaret asked softly. About miracles, Jake replied, and how they come disguised as ordinary moments. Emma had fallen asleep, her head on Margaret's shoulder. His wife and sister, both safe, both heading toward a future bright with possibility. Jake had never believed in providence, but looking at them, he reconsidered. Maybe God did work in mysterious ways, or maybe love just made its own miracles. Either way, Jake Sullivan was grateful. The ranch thrived through summer. Emma took to frontier life with surprising enthusiasm, her talent for organization making her invaluable. She transformed the chaotic ranch records into neat ledgers, established a school for the Hans children, and despite her growing pregnancy, insisted on helping with the garden. I need to be useful, she told Jake when he protested. I was idle too long in San Francisco, feeling sorry for myself. This, she gestured at the bustling ranch, this is living. Margaret's pregnancy progressed well, though Dr. Morrison no relation to the scoundrel. Charles insisted she slow down. Jake often found her conducting ranch business from a rocking chair on the new house's wide porch, issuing orders like a general from headquarters. It was on a hot August afternoon that everything changed. Jake was in the lower pasture, helping repair a fence, when he saw the dust cloud. Riders, moving fast. Too fast for a social call. Miguel, he called. Trouble coming. By the time the riders reached the main house, Jake and the Hans were ready, but the lead rider raised his hands peacefully. Jake recognized him. Federal Marshal Tom Garrett. Mr. Sullivan, Garrett said, dismounting. We need to talk. It's about your brother-in-law. Jake's blood chilled. Richard was supposed to hang next month. What about him? He escaped 3 days ago. Had help from the inside. Guard named Peterson. Turns out Richard had something on him from years back. Margaret emerged from the house, Emma supporting her. Both women paled at the news. He'll come here, Margaret said quietly. He blames me for everything. We've got men watching the roads, Garrett assured her. But you're right. This is where he'll head. I'm leaving to deputies. And the shot came from the ridge, taking Garrett's hat off. More shots followed as everyone dove for cover. Jake pulled Margaret behind a water trough, his rifle already in his hands. The house, Margaret cried. Emma. Jake looked and cursed. Emma was trapped on the porch, crouched behind a pillar as bullets splintered the wood around her. What followed was the longest 10 minutes of Jake's life. The attackers had good positions but hadn't counted on the ranch hand's loyalty. Miguel and his men fought like demons, slowly pushing the attackers back. Jake made a desperate run for the porch, bullets whining past. He reached Emma just as she cried out, clutching her side where red bloomed across her dress. No. Jake gathered her in his arms, racing for the door. In the house, he laid her on the sofa, pressing his hands against the wound. Jake, Emma gasped. The baby. Dr. Morrison arrived with the shocking speed of Providence. He'd been visiting a neighboring ranch and heard the gunfire as he worked. On Emma, the shooting outside intensified, then suddenly stopped. Got them, Miguel shouted. All down or running. But Jake barely heard. His attention was fixed on his sister's pale face, on Doc Morrison's grim expression. The bullet missed. The vital organs, the doctor said. But the baby's coming. Now the next hours blurred together. Emma's labor was hard and fast, complicated by blood loss. Margaret, despite her own condition, refused to leave Emma's side. She held her sister-in-law's hand, whispered encouragement, shared the strength that had carried her through her own trials. As sunset painted the sky red, a baby's cry filled the house. A girl, small but healthy. She's beautiful, Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. But I can't. I'm not strong enough. Yes, you are, Margaret said fiercely. You're a Sullivan now. We're all strong. Doc Morrison's face was grave as he pulled Jake aside. She's lost too much blood. I've done what I can, but nothing, Jake said. She'll make it. She has to. The night was long and terrible. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness while Jake and Margaret took turns sitting with her. The baby, wrapped in soft blankets, slept peacefully, unaware of the drama surrounding her entry into the world. It was near dawn when Emma's fever broke. Her eyes opened, clear and focused. Jake, I'm here. He gripped her hand. The baby. Perfect. Waiting for her mama to name her. Emma smiled weakly. Hope. Her name is Hope. Because that's what you gave me when you found me. Outside, Marshal Garrett appeared in the doorway. We caught one of the attackers alive. Richard hired them, all right. But Jake, Richard wasn't with them. He sent them as a distraction. Distraction from what? Jake asked. Tad, his answer came from Margaret's sudden gasp. She stood in the window, staring at the barn. Smoke was beginning to rise from the hayloft. Fire! Someone shouted. The barn's on fire. But Margaret wasn't looking at the barn anymore. Her face had gone white, her hands pressed to her belly. Jake, she said, her voice strangely calm. The baby's coming. Jake looked between his sister, barely clinging to life, and his wife, going into labor 2 months early. Outside, the barn fire spread, despite the hands' efforts. And somewhere in the darkness, Richard Henderson waited. Doc, Jake called. We need you. Morrison looked harried. I can't be in 2 places at once. Then tell me what to do, Jake said. I'll deliver my child if I have to. Margaret gripped his hand. No. Get Mrs. Morrison. Catherine Morrison from the Double M. She's delivered half the babies in this county. As Jake sent riders for help, as the barn burned and Emma fought for life and Margaret labored in pain, one thought echoed in his mind. They'd survived so much. They couldn't lose now. Not when they'd come so far. Not when they'd finally found home. Catherine Morrison arrived as the sun crested the horizon, her medical bag in one hand and a shotgun in the other. Heard you had some trouble, she said calmly, as if barn fires and gunfights were everyday occurrences. Where's my patient? Jake had never been more grateful to see anyone. He led her to Margaret, while Doc Morrison continued tending to Emma. The house had become a makeshift hospital, with the hands' wives arriving to help. 2 months early is concerning, Catherine said after examining Margaret. But I've delivered earlier babies who thrived. The important thing is to stay calm. Calm. Jake almost laughed. His sister lay fighting for her life, His wife was in premature labor, his barn was ashes, and a murderer lurked somewhere nearby. Calm was the last thing he felt. But Margaret squeezed his hand and smiled through her pain. "We've faced worse," she said. "Remember the auction?" That grounded him. She was right. They'd survived when everything was against them. They'd survived this too. The labor was difficult. The baby was coming too fast, and Margaret was exhausted from the stress. Jake stayed by her side, letting her grip his hand hard enough to crack bones, whispering encouragement when she faltered. "I can't," Margaret gasped after a particularly hard contraction. "Yes, you can," Jake said firmly. "You're the strongest woman I know. You stood up to your uncle. You rebuilt this ranch. You saved Emma. You can do this." From the other room came the thin cry of baby hope, and Emma's weak voice singing a lullaby. The sound seemed to give Margaret strength. "For them," she said. "For our family." An hour later, as the morning sun streamed through the windows, James William Sullivan entered the world. Small but fierce, he announced his arrival with a cry that could be heard across the ranch. "He's perfect," Catherine declared, placing the baby in Margaret's arms. "Small, but his lungs are clear, and his color's good. He's a fighter, like his parents." Jake stared at his son, overwhelmed. The tiny fingers, the shock of dark hair, the way he immediately rooted toward his mother. It was miraculous and terrifying, all at once. "James for my father," Margaret said softly. "William for yours. Is that all right?" Jake could only nod, his throat too tight for words. The peaceful moment shattered as Miguel burst in. "Senor Jake, we found tracks. One man, heading toward the old mine. The mine where Colonel Henderson had hidden evidence. Where this had all started." Jake kissed Margaret and his son. Checked on Emma sleeping now, with Hope in a cradle beside her, and grabbed his rifle. "I'm going with you," Marshal Garrett said. "No." Jake's voice was flat. "This is between Richard and me." "Jake," Margaret called. But he was already gone. The ride to the mine was silent, except for Thunder's hooves on the rocky trail. Jake knew he should wait for help, should let the law handle it. But Richard had threatened his family for the last time. He found Richard's horse tied outside the mine entrance. Moving carefully, Jake entered the shaft. Light flickered from deeper in a lantern. Richard stood in the same alcove where they'd found the evidence. Frantically digging, he'd made a hole in the wall, revealing another strongbox. 20 years, Richard muttered, not turning around. 20 years I waited. The old fool never knew I'd found his real treasure. "It's over, Richard," Jake said, rifle trained on the man's back. Richard spun, a pistol in his hand. But Jake was ready. The rifle boomed in the confined space. Richard's shot went wide as Jake's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. "You should have killed me," Richard gasped, clutching his wound. "I'm not you," Jake said. "Death's too easy. You'll live to hang." As Marshal Garrett and his deputies took Richard away, Jake investigated the hole he'd been digging. The strong box contained gold certificates worth a fortune, apparently. Colonel Henderson had been wealthier than even Margaret knew, but Jake barely glanced at them. His family was waiting. He returned to find the ranch in celebration. Emma was sitting up, holding Hope. Margaret was nursing James. The burned barn was already being cleared for rebuilding. Neighbors arriving with lumber and supplies. "Did you find him?" Margaret asked. "Marshal Garrett has him. It's over. Really over this time." Margaret smiled. "No, it's just beginning." As if to emphasize her point, James opened his eyes, the same bright blue as his mother's, and seemed to look right at Jake. "Hello, son," Jake said softly. "Welcome to the world." That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, the Sullivan family gathered on the porch. Emma and Hope, Margaret and James. Jake surveying his unexpected kingdom. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked. "About how a year ago, I was alone in the mountains with just my axe for company. And now you're surrounded by crying babies and recovering women and a ranch to run," Margaret teased, having second thoughts. Jake pulled her close, careful of the baby between them. "Never. I spent too long thinking I deserved to be alone, punishing myself for surviving when my family didn't. But you showed me something." "What's that?" "That love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing. You chose me when I was just a lumberjack. You chose to see more in me than I saw in myself. And you chose me when I was nothing but a confused woman on an auction block." Margaret countered. "You chose to pay a price you couldn't afford for someone you didn't know." "Best $50 I ever spent," Jake said. Emma laughed from her chair. "Only you two could turn a debt auction into a love story." As night fell over the Henderson Ranch, soon to be officially renamed the Sullivan Ranch, Jake held his family close. The future stretched before them, bright with promise. There would be challenges, he knew. Raising children on the frontier was never easy. The ranch would demand constant work. Emma would need time to fully heal, body and spirit, but they'd face it together. A lumberjack, a lost heiress, a fallen woman, and 2 babies born of crisis. An unlikely family, forged in hardship and sealed with love. In the distance, a wolf howled, lonely and wild. But here, in the circle of lamplight, there was warmth and belonging and hope. Jake Sullivan had come home at last.